Hey everybody, I know sometimes the topics I cover on this channel can get a little bit intense, perhaps like this video you guys are going to be watching today, so I just wanted to remind you guys that my puppy Casper has his own YouTube channel, so if you need a little bit of wholesome goodness after this video, make sure to check it out. Links for his channel will be in the description box down below, or just type in Casper the Friendly Floof on YouTube. Love you guys, let's get into the video. I love a good spoopy moment, just like everyone else does every once in a while. Sometimes when I'm bored, I'll watch some true crime or some weird serial killer documentaries. It's something I've always found fascinating in a really weird and somewhat uncomfortable way. But there has always been one in particular who always seems to be downplayed and has some of the weirdest, most disturbing, and kind of interesting history. And I always find myself wanting to learn more about how he did what he did and how he was able to get away with it for so long. So hey there, and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Blair, or the Illuminati, and today we're going to discuss one of the most famous American serial killers to date, H.H. Holmes. This psychotic mastermind has devised some of the most twisted murders in the 19th century, a fraudulent, demented man with his heart set out for blood and money. So what did this man have to do to leave such a murderous mark in history? Well, let's find out. Before we go into detail about his childhood and each murder, we need to understand his character. Herman Webster Mudgett, otherwise known as Dr. Henry Howard Holmes, has been an infamous serial killer. He confessed to 27 murders, but only 9 have ever been truly confirmed. Speculations suggest he killed as many as 200 people, though this is questionable as this is only traced to the 1940s pulp magazines, aka the tabloids. Some of the people he claimed to have killed were still alive, so it's really hard to know the exact number of victims. Regardless, the fate of these victims were far from pretty. Holmes used a fake mixed-use building, which he owned, to set up his fake hotel. This hotel, known as the World's Fair Hotel, now called the Murder Castle, was where several of his murders took place. The Murder Castle was located west of the 1883 World's Fair Columbian Exposition, hence the name World's Fair Hotel. Evidence shows this hotel was never ran as a business, though. Additionally, Holmes was a fraud and a bigamist and partook in more than 50 lawsuits in Chicago alone. Many stories regarding his crime have been proven to be false and fiction, so very little is known about the truth of the matter. Now, how about that? Let's use what information we have and put the pieces of the puzzle together, starting with his early life. Holmes was born with the legal name Herman Webster Mudgett in Glimmelton, New Hampshire, United States, May 16, 1861. And in this video, I'm going to call him Holmes throughout the video as not to confuse anyone, but do keep in mind his name was changed later in his life. His parents were Levi Horton Mudgett and Theodate Page Price. Both of his parents descended from the first English immigrants in the area. Additionally, Holmes had an older sister Ellen and older brother Arthur, a younger brother Henry, and a younger sister Mary. Holmes's father Levi originating from a farming family and worked as a farmer, trader, and house painter. Both of his parents were devout Methodists and practiced their faith frequently. Both of his parents were disciplinarians and were strict in their behavior, as some sources state. Attempts to make Holmes fit into the atypical serial killer model have described Holmes as torturing animals and suffering abuse from his violent father as a child. Additionally, there is another account of his life that even suggests he killed a childhood playmate. Furthermore, there is a rumor that Holmes's father was a violent alcoholic, beat his children, and locked them in the attic when they misbehaved, though these contemporary and eyewitness accounts are not proof, so take that with a pinch of salt. Fast forward to the age of 16, Holmes graduated from high school. He began to get teaching jobs in Gilmanton and later in nearby Alton. On July 4, 1878, he married a young woman by the name of Clara Lovering in Alton. They had a son, Robert Lovering Mudgett, who was born on February 3, 1880 in London, New Hampshire. As an adult, Robert Mudgett became a certified public accountant and served as the city manager of Orlando, Florida. At 18 years old, Holmes enrolled in the University of Vermont in Burlington, Vermont. He was dissatisfied with the university and decided to leave the school after 1 year of attendance. In 1882, he entered the University of Michigan's Department of Medicine and Surgery. He then graduated in June 1884 after passing his examinations. While Holmes was enrolled in this medical program, he worked in an anatomy lab under Professor Herdman, who was the chief anatomy instructor. Holmes had apprenticed in New Hampshire under Dr. Nahum Wright, a supporter of practicing human dissection. Later in life, when Holmes was suspected to murder, he claimed to be nothing more than an insurance fraud. He admitted he used cadavers to defraud life insurance companies multiple times during college. It is claimed that he would steal these cadavers from the lab, burn or disfigure them, and plant the bodies to make it appear as if they died by accident. He would take out the insurance policies on these people before planting their bodies and collect the money once the bodies were discovered. As for his family life, it doesn't get much better. Many housemates described Holmes treating his wife Clara violently. In 1884, before his graduation, Clara moved back to New Hampshire and wrote she knew little of him afterwards. This same year, in 1884, Holmes passed his medical exams. He moved to Moores Forks, New York. A mass rumor spread that Holmes had been seen with a small boy who later disappeared. Little is actually known if he killed the boy or not. Though Holmes claimed the boy went back to his house in Massachusetts, no further investigation took place, and Holmes quickly left the town afterwards. Later, Holmes traveled to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and got a job as a keeper at the Norristown State Hospital. After a few days at the job, he quit and got a new position at a drugstore in Philadelphia. While he was working at the drugstore, a boy died after taking medicine that was purchased at that store. Holmes denied being involved in the death of the child and immediately left the city. Right before he left for Chicago, this is when he changed his name to Henry Howard Holmes to avoid being linked to his previous scandals. In August 1886, Holmes then moved to Chicago and took a job as a pharmacist. He was called Dr. H. Holmes. He came across a drugstore owned by Elizabeth S. Holton. This store was located at the southwest corner of South Wallace Avenue and West 63rd Street in Inglewood. Elizabeth Holton gave Holmes a job, as Holmes proves to be a hard worker. Eventually, Holmes bought the store, though a handful of books state Holton's husband was an old man who vanished along with his wife. This could not be true, as Dr. Holton was a fellow Michigan alumni and a couple years older than Holmes himself. Both Mrs. and Mr. Holton stayed in Inglewood through Holmes's life and lived into the 20th century. The myth that Holmes killed both of them is not true and has been debunked. Well, in later 1886, while he was still married to his wife Clara, Holmes married Myrta Delknap in Minneapolis, Minnesota. He filed for divorce from Clara just weeks after marrying her, alleging infidelity on her part. The claims were never proven and the suit went nowhere. Surviving paperwork from the screwy divorce indicated Clara was never even informed of the suit. This leaves us to assume the divorce was never finalized and was dismissed on June 4, 1891, on the ground of want of prosecution. While disregarding his family life, Holmes purchased a lot across the drugstore and began construction in 1887 for a two-story multiple-use building. This building had apartments on the second floor and retail spaces. When Holmes did not pay the architects or the construction company, they both sued in 1888. Later, with his new wife Myrtha, they had a daughter, Lucy Theodate Holmes, that was born on July 4, 1889 in Inglewood, Chicago, Illinois. As an adult, Lucy became a public school teacher. Additionally, Holmes lived with Myrta and Lucy in Wilmette, Illinois, and spent most of his time in Chicago tending to a personal business. Speaking of personal business, in 1892, he added a third floor to the Murder Hotel and told both investors and suppliers he intended to use it as a hotel. Additionally, he claimed the hotel would be used for the World's Columbian Exposition, though the hotel portion was never fulfilled or built. First off, what is the Columbian Exposition? For further clarification, the Columbian Exposition, now known as the World's Fair in Chicago, celebrates the anniversary of Christopher Columbus's arrival. This exhibition features many wondrous sights, such as the first gas-powered motor car, the Damier quadricycle, and the 1,500-pound statue of Venus de Milo made entirely out of chocolate. Nowadays, the murder castle and H. Holmes' axe have tainted this holiday and remind many of the infamous serial killer. Now, returning our attention back to the castle's construction, furniture suppliers found that H. Holmes was hiding their materials that were never paid for in hidden rooms throughout the murder castle. But what was the castle like? Inside of the building, there were soundproofed rooms, maze-like hallways, and some seemed to lead to nowhere, as a matter of fact, and many of the rooms contained chutes that would drop victims down to the basement, where Holmes had acid vats, quicklime, and a crematorium to get rid of bodies. Many believe the murder castle had torture equipment, but while he did not murder people brutally, the use of torture equipment is simply fiction and fable. Sooner or later, the press found out and the search made news. A jeweler, we don't know much about this man, showed the investors the articles on the hotel's horrific features. The investors retracted their deal immediately. Somehow, though, Holmes schemed enough money to improvise on his new hotel. In 1892, the hotel was mostly completed and had 3 stories and a basement. The first floor was a storefront, the second with torture rooms and previously mentioned basement chutes, and the third floor held more apartment rooms. 2 years later, in 1884, during a police investigation, the authorities found some disturbing sights. During the investigation, the police found rooms with hinged walls and false partitions, rooms linked with secret passageways, and even airtight rooms that were connected to pipelines filled with gas, which Holmes used as gas chambers. According to Wikipedia, it says that Holmes would use chutes to deliver the bodies to the basement, and once there, he made use of surgical tables and had an array of medicinal tools and would dissect them before selling their organs and bones on the black market to medical institutions. So there's definitely a lot more going on here than just collecting property, life insurance policies, and murdering. He would also straight up dissect people and then sell their organs to universities for research. Around this time, Holmes's family life changed too. If you thought it'd stop there, you'd be wrong. Holmes married yet another woman, Georgiana Yoke, on January 17, 1894 in Denver, Colorado, while still married to Clara and Myrta. Does this man ever stop with the amount of unfiled divorces? For someone who plans out a murder hotel so carefully without getting caught, you'd think he'd be able to file a divorce properly. Now that we know the inside and outside information of the murder castle, let's go through the list of murders leading up to Holmes's arrest. One of H.H. Holmes' first murder victims was his mistress, Julia Smythe. Miss Smythe was the wife of Ned Connor, who had moved into Holmes's building and worked at his pharmacy jewelry counter. Perhaps Ned Connor was the previously mentioned jeweler who ratted Holmes out. Regardless, Connor found out about Smythe's affair with Holmes and left his job and moved away. Connor left Smythe and her daughter Pearl behind, leaving Smythe full custody of Pearl. Julia continued to live at the murder house with her daughter Pearl, continuing her love affair with Holmes. Both Julia and Pearl disappeared on Christmas Eve, 1891. Holmes later claimed she died during an abortion, though what really happened to the two was never confirmed by authorities. The two most likely died from Holmes' desire to murder, and many believed he killed them both. Another case that is yet to be confirmed but many point to Holmes is the death of Emmeline Cingrande. Emmeline began to work at the murder castle in May of 1892 and disappeared that same year in December. Additionally, another woman vanished named Edna Van Tassel, who was believed to be one of Holmes's several victims. So I'm hoping you guys are starting to see a pattern here, because I sure do. H.H. Holmes was notorious for luring women into his life and hotel and then murdering them with an excellent cover-up. This is like the infamous Jack the Ripper and his hidden scandals. Furthermore, countless women had died in his clutches, so let's continue to search for more of his murderous schemes. While Holmes was working at the Chemical Bank building on Dearborn Street, Holmes met a man named Benjamin Pitezel, and they became close friends through a short period of time. Benjamin was a carpenter with a sketchy criminal history. He was exhibiting in the same building and a coal bin he himself had created. Holmes saw a perfect opportunity and potential in him. Holmes decided to use Pitezel as his right-hand man for a multitude of crimes. A district attorney later described him as Holmes's tool, his creature. One of the first deaths and crimes the two performed together was in April 1893. It all started when a one-shot actress named Minnie Williams moved to Chicago. There are rumors that Holmes met this woman earlier in life in Boston, but Holmes himself claimed to have met her in an employment office. Additionally, Holmes offered her a job at the hotel as his personal stenographer, basically a secretary position. Williams accepted his job opportunity immediately. Somehow or the other, I cannot fathom how this happened, but Holmes convinced Minnie Williams to transfer the deed to her property in Fort Worth, Texas, to a man named Alexander Bond, aka a fake alias of Holmes himself. In April 1883, Williams transferred her property deed, with Holmes serving as the notary. That next month, Holmes and Williams, showcasing themselves as man and wife, rented an apartment in Chicago's Lincoln Park, not to be confused with Lincoln Park the band. Minnie's sister Annie later came for a visit to see the two lovebirds, and in July, Annie wrote to her aunt that she would accompany her brother Harry to an exposition to Europe. The catch, neither Minnie nor Annie were ever seen alive after July 5, 1893, and in the end, Holmes later signed this deed over to his partner in crime, Pitezel, giving him the alias of Benton T. Lindman, which is really beyond disturbing, just this whole situation. The heinous crime master himself, H. Holmes, had an entrepreneurial spirit at best. Concerning his formal education and connections, he was able to sell skeletons to medical labs and schools. He, and sometimes a hired assistant, were accused of stripping the flesh off of the bodies, dissecting them, and preparing the viable skeletons. The rest of the remains would be tossed in pits of lime or acid, effectively breaking down any evidence. In other words, he stole souls, bodies, and valuables all in one transaction. So how can one man get away with this? Well, obviously, it turns out he couldn't. Insurance companies noticed this pattern each time he would claim someone's policy. The insurance companies then pressed and prosecuted Holmes for arson. He fled and left Chicago in July 1894. He popped up back again in Fort Worth, Texas, where he inherited property from the previously mentioned Williams sisters. This property is in the current-day Commerce Street and 2nd Street. At this location, he planned to construct another murder castle along with his current Chicago operation. His plan was to do the exact same thing by stealing from several suppliers. Though he would never get to make that second castle because in July 1894, Holmes was arrested and incarcerated for the first time. His charge was for selling mortgaged goods in St. Louis, Missouri. He was bailed out, but while he was in jail, he met an outlaw named Marion Hedgepeth who was serving 25 years. Holmes thought up another diabolical scheme to fake out another insurance company for $10,000 by taking out a policy on himself by faking his own death. Please note that $10,000 in 1884 is now equal to $296,000 in today's money. Hedgepeth was promised a $500 commission fee in exchange for a lawyer who could be trusted to carry out his plan. Holmes was told that a St. Louis attorney named Jephthah Howe could do the job. Howe was a new, young attorney in practice with his older brother, Alphonso Howe. These two men had no previous involvement with Holmes or Pitezel or their several crooked deeds. Jephthah Howe, on the other hand, found Holmes's corrupted plans to be brilliant. Regardless, the faking his whole death thing failed, and the insurance company became suspicious and refused to pay. Holmes did not press the claim, rather he decided to create a similar plan with Pitezel, his partner in crime, so you can kinda see where this is going. Pitezel agreed to fake his own death so his wife could collect the $10,000 life insurance policy, which he would therefore split with Holmes and Jephthah. The plan was scheduled to take place in Philadelphia, in which Pitezel was to pose as an inventor under the name B.F. Perry and would be killed in a lab explosion. Not kidding. Furthermore, Holmes was supposed to find a cadaver to play the role of Pitezel, but instead he flat out killed Pitezel by knocking him unconscious with chloroform and then setting his body on fire with benzene. In Holmes's later confession, he stated Pitezel was alive after he used the chloroform on him before he set him on fire, but forensic evidence pointed to the chloroform being placed after his death. The insurance company was unaware of this, and perhaps this happened to make it look like a suicide in case Holmes would to be charged with murder. Regardless if he was set on fire alive or unconscious, this is some fucked up shit. Holmes passed go and collected his insurance payout though. He only got away with this plan because Pitezel's corpse was authentic. Holmes went to Pitezel's wife and convinced her to give 3 of her 5 children to be in his custody, and how he did this I will never know. The 3 children, Alice, Nellie, and Howard, were all in Mr. Holmes's custody, and they traveled throughout the northwestern US and even into Canada. Yep, traveling with the man who burned your father's corpse, possibly while alive. Totally cool though, apparently. While they were on their travels, he escorted Mrs. Pitezel along a similar route, while using many aliases and lying to Mrs. Pitezel about her husband's death. He claimed that Pitezel was hiding in London and lied to her about where her 3 missing children were. In Detroit, before entering Canada, they were only separated by a few blocks even. Holmes later confessed to the murder of Alice and Nellie by forcing them into a large trunk and locking them inside. He then drilled a hole in the lid of the trunk and put one end of the hose through the hole, attaching another end to a gas line to asphyxiate the children. He then buried their naked bodies in the cellar of his rental house located on 16 St. Vincent Street in Toronto. Soon after, Frank Geyer, a Philadelphia PD detective, was assigned to find the 3 missing children and to investigate Holmes. This man outwitted this horrifying villain and found the 2 Pitezel children bodies in the cellar of the Toronto home. Detective Geyer wrote, "The deeper we dug, the more horrible the odor became, and when we reached the depth of 3 feet, we discovered what appeared to be the bone of a forearm of a human being." Right after this disturbing discovery occurred, Geyer was sent to Indianapolis, where Holmes had rented a cottage. There were reports in the area that Holmes visited a pharmacy to purchase drugs that killed Howard Pitezel, one of the missing children, and a repair goods store to sharpen knives, in which he chopped up the body and burned it. Detectives found the boy's teeth and bone marrow inside the cottage chimney. The chain of murderous greed ended when Holmes was arrested in Boston in November 17, 1984, after being hunted down by the Pinkertons, a detective agency. Holmes was held on a warrant of horse theft in Texas. Authorities became suspicious when Holmes appeared wanting to flee the country to accompany his third wife. After the 2 bodies of Alice and Nellie were later found in late 1895, Chicago police began to investigate the murder castle. Many claims were made, but 0 evidence was found to get Holmes convicted in Chicago. In October of 1895, Holmes was put on trial for the murder of his business partner, Benjamin Pitezel. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. By this point in time, there was solid proof he had murdered the children. Additionally, during the trial, he confessed to 27 murders in Chicago, Indianapolis, and Toronto, along with 6 attempted murders. One thing sketchy about his confession was some people he claimed to have killed were actually still alive, and the reason he did this? The Hearst newspapers promised and paid Holmes $7,500 in exchange for a confession. That's quite a large amount of money, considering $7,500 would be worth $230,000 today. Despite this, the confession was later found to be false and just for show. Another interesting aspect about his confession stories is his several accounts of his life. His final confession he stood by was that he was innocent and possessed by Satan. His several lies were part of his scam to confuse researchers and, obviously, people here on YouTube who try to understand this mystery. The truth in H.H. Holmes's life is always going to be a confusing mess, and we cannot really be certain about what exactly happened. While Holmes was writing a confession in prison, he mentioned how his face appeared drastically different since his imprisonment, how it was gruesome and taking a satanical cast. He also wrote about how he was convinced after everything horrid he did that he was just now beginning to look like the devil. Until he met his death, Holmes was calm and even fearless. He showed very little signs of anxiety or depression as his death sentence was reaching closer. At last, the murderous psychopath met his death on May 7, 1896. He was hanged at Moyamensing Prison, now known as the Philadelphia County Prison, for the murder of his best friend Pitezel. Strange enough, Holmes' neck did not snap either, so he actually strangled slowly to death. Reports say he was twitching for over 15 minutes before finally being announced dead 20 minutes after the hanging took place. Even weirder, though, was that he requested his coffin to be buried 10 feet deep and contained in cement. And why would you ask for that request, you might ask? Well, because he was afraid of what he did to others happening to him, robbers stealing his body and dissecting it. But whatever happened to Hedgepath, the man who helped Holmes in prison? Hedgepath was pardoned for being an informant on Holmes, but on New Year's Eve of 1909, he was shot to death by a police officer named Edward Jarbuck. This took place during a holdup at a Chicago saloon. Almost 20 years after Holmes' death on March 7, 1914, the Chicago Tribune reported the following. With the death of Quinlan, the former caretaker of the castle, the mysterious Holmes Castle would remain unexplained. This Quinlan was just as odd as the rest of them. He committed suicide by taking strychnine. His dead body was later found in his bedroom, and a note was left that read, "I couldn't sleep." Their surviving relatives claimed he was haunted for months on end and that he had many hallucinations. As for the castle, a coincidental thing happened to it. A mysterious fire gutted the murder castle in August 1895. The New York Times reported that 2 men were seen entering the back of the building between 8 and 9 p.m. About a half an hour later, they were seen exiting the building, rapidly running away. Following several explosions, the castle went up in flames. Detectives found half-full gas cans under the back steps of the building, but surprisingly, the building survived the fire. It remained in use but was torn down in 1938. Where the castle once stood is now occupied by the Inglewood branch of the USPS. So let's return back to slightly more present times. In 2017, there were many allegations that H.H. Holmes escaped his death sentence. To find out the truth, his body was exhumed for testing. This investigation was led by Janet Mong of the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. This is ironic considering that this was what he was afraid of happening. Undoubtedly, because his coffin was contained in cement, his body did not decompose naturally. Also, his clothes were almost perfectly intact, and his mustache was also found to be intact. The body was only identified as H.H. Holmes because his teeth tested positive. Afterwards, once the University of Pennsylvania finished their research, they reburied the body. You can find Holmes's grave at the Holy Cross Cemetery located in Yeadon, Delaware County, Pennsylvania. Now, as of the present day of 2020, we can see most of these events quite clearly, but some mystery definitely still lingers. What happened to the other supposed 200 victims who were murdered? Who else was involved? Still, some major and minor details remain unsolved, though many works of nonfiction and fiction have elaborated on the murder doctor and his murder castle, but we still have no clue about some aspects of this mystery. Maybe the best mysteries remain unsolved, or maybe someday in the future we'll know. But what do you think happened really? Let me know in the description box down below. And with that being said, that's where I'm going to end today's video. So let me know what you guys think of it. I know it was a little bit of a creepier video today, but it's something that's always really fascinated me. If you guys liked the video, leave a like, and if you guys are new to the channel, hit that subscribe button. If you guys want more content from me, you can pop open the description box where you'll find links to all of my social media, second channel for my puppy Casper, collab channel with Sad Milk, links for everything will be down below. So again guys, thank you so much for making it to another video. I love you so much, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys!